Now your yarn is captured, Nicholas. Right after I clicked recording. Cool. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to Research Jam 6, and the first one in 2022. Today we have 6 speakers. We have an hour, so we will have 10 minutes, but leave maybe 1 or 2 minutes for transition and for questions. If you people from the audience have a burning question, you can ask, but we would encourage you to save the questions to Discord, where we would have a voice channel hangout after. Cool, we can get started. So for other speakers, if you are here, can you raise your hand so I can make you a co-host? And yeah, without further ado, Nicholas, you can get started.
All right. So slightly different than some of the other papers I was looking at. This is less of a how can we advance deep learning paper and more of a how can we use machine learning to kind of find new mathematical ideas as a tool. And so the base idea is we have all these color spaces, and the last kind of 40 years of research has mainly been around finding more perceptually uniform, more perceptually useful in kind of different scientific venues, types of color spaces. And before that, there was this really interesting research by Goethe of finding the hue circle and kind of what symmetries are natural in color that humans can view. And so my idea is how can we go past that and find something higher dimensional than just a circle? So if you know anything about color spaces, you've probably heard of lab, and it's often represented as a sphere. This is a decent representation of lab, but it's really not a sphere. It's this shape. So for 2 reasons: one, it's not spherically uniform. The other reason is if you look at even the sphere representation, from top to bottom, you have white at the top and black at the bottom. And so the color isn't really distributed on a sphere, it's distributed on a disk, and then the lightness is up and down on the sphere. So to be a real sphere, you would want something like a radial symmetry in different shells around that sphere. So you see an example here. This is where Goethe has this radial symmetry around S1. And so can we find 2 of these radial symmetries around the shell of a sphere that represent just color with no lightness values, no white or dark? So then the white or dark would start in the center of the ball and move towards the outside. So if you look here, these are some of the interesting things you can kind of do given the color sphere, or sorry, the color circle. And these end up being really useful to artists where they pick different balances of colors, and there's these natural symmetries that arise that are really pleasing to the human eye. And so if you had this kind of shell-based symmetry, you could put different patterns on top of that as well and find similar things. There's also these kind of different hypercube transformations you could do. So if you want to just transform the color space, like say expand blue or expand red, you could do this in different interesting ways on the shell of a sphere instead of just manipulating the circles. And for potential approaches, I think there's a couple ways to do this. There's some really interesting new work in geometric deep learning. And so one approach would just be, the second one here is take a bunch of data, compress it on a recolorization task, and then pull out a latent code that is, constrain that space to be spherical. And then the other approach would be more similar, which is, can we take that lab sphere and can we use kind of a similar way that people have found lab in the past by training it with different constraints? And can we reparameterize? It's actually a pretty small matrix, I think 6 by 6, the one that's used in this OK lab version. Can we reparameterize that with, instead of hue as the constraint, with this sort of spherical quaternion rotations? And that's all I have. I'd love to take some questions because I feel like there's probably some vagary here. And does anybody have any thoughts?
So can you go one slide? Yeah, that one slide forward.
This guy.
That one. No, one back. So I don't understand like what framework you're using to answer this question as no. Like, is there a distribution here you're considering and the distribution doesn't fit in this sphere, it fits in a square? And if so, like, what are the data points? Like, what are the data points that push this thing on the right to have a weird shape that it has?
It's really, this was a little misleading. It's more about the white to black pole that runs through the sphere here.
Okay.
Up and down. And so typically when you're talking about spheres in math, you come up from S0 is a point, S1 is a ring, and then S2 is a shell of a sphere. And so we really want to find a spherical shell. We don't want to find, because this would be a sphere circle that runs across this color plane, and then up and down would be just a line symmetry. And so what we really want to find is a shell symmetry, and then white and black would be along this radial line coming out, which you can kind of see more in this one. So
I see. So you want to represent all hues. So not black, not white, but all colors, but you want to represent it as an S2 shell instead of an S1 circle.
Exactly. So there'd be some new value you could find, call it brilliance, that would have S2 instead of S1. And then your lightness would be, because there's also versions of HSL where it's a cone and things like that, or a cylinder. And we find the shell so that we can then expand it in this direction. The kind of biggest constraint on having hue right now is you can only do these rotations around the circle, and that's mainly how colors are represented. And so if you can increase, because really if you could find an S2, you could kind of take this same parameterization and expand it to S3, all the way up to S12 or so. And like, how can we do kind of either smaller, more nuanced, or more interesting transformations on color space?
Okay, interesting. I don't want to talk too much, but one final thought is, because humans have three color receptors in their eyes, there's kind of like three types of neurons, red, green, blue, that might be spiking more or less. And so in one conceptualization, these 3 points, you could imagine, like, no matter how you look at them in space, they always define like a plane, and like going between them is always kind of like a circle. Like maybe 3 points is not enough to support a shell shape, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I guess there's a perceptual system between all that, and enough ambiguity about how we process color that I'm hoping we're not anchored on those 3 points. But it's a valid concern. I think I've played with like just doing some geometric constructions, deconstructing hue as well. And so you have, like, if you look at RGB as additive and CMYK as subtractive, you can kind of pull those two out, and then you have 2 pairs of 3, and then you can rearrange that into a like double-sided pyramid, and that gets you something along the shell of a sphere that would then look different than a hue circle. So there's like the interesting property that a perceptual similarity between colors isn't necessarily along this circle. So that gives some
yeah. Interesting.
Can you talk a little bit about how to find the parameterization, which is, I think, equivalent to training, right? Gather a few images and then kind of map it to the shell.
Yeah, you could do one where you kind of do the latent code that I had said that way, but I think the opposite would be you take pairs of colors. So the way color spaces are typically found, like lab, you generate 2 pairs of colors, and then based on collected data of human visible distance, like how similar we think those 2 colors are, and then you test those in a new color system. Do they stay similarly distant from each other? So you just run through tons and tons of pairs of colors, and then you see, how does my parameterization compress it? And so that's when you can typically do something on like a smaller matrix, and you just need to find like 9 parameters or so.
I think that's a good idea, and that should work. It should be pretty straightforward. So now it's like a distance learning or metric learning thing.
Yeah, the thing I'd love help with, if anybody's interested in working on this project the most, is like geometric losses around the sphere. I kind of have some simple versions I can think of with like quaternion rotation and measuring neighbors, but then you lose these like kind of global band symmetries, and because you're only having local symmetries reinforcing. Maybe that's enough, because forcing it to be on a sphere and then local symmetries, it'll just work its way out. But would be interesting to put like kind of group symmetry constraints on that at a global level.
I think if you tried it without those and just saw how it worked, that would be a good place to start. And then you might see, it's like broken in this really weird way, or like one 5 runs out of 10 are broken, but the other 5 kind of do converge to nice global symmetry.
Right.
Maybe that's enough already.
Right.
People ask some questions in the chat you could check out too.
Let's see. S2. That's a good question. Probably more time. We should go into that in the Discord. The hairy ball question. And someone mentioned that people maybe have 4 receptors. Interesting. All right. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Yeah, awesome.
Okay, next we move to Paul. You're ready, you can share.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome, great. All right. Hi, thanks for organizing this. So I did a thing, and that thing was I approached content recommender systems from a slightly different perspective. That's the task of trying to find interesting documents for a certain user among a pool of candidate documents. And here I'm taking interesting to mean a mismatch, a contrast between the user's beliefs, their models of the world, and what the actual document states. Like the document, in some sense, is surprising, and that makes it interesting. Similarly, a document which isn't that interesting doesn't provide those unpredictable, unexpected perspectives for the user. There's just a coherence between their beliefs, their models of the world, and what's stated in the document. And my hypothesis and the core idea behind this presentation is that maybe we can try to, let me use my pointer here. Maybe we can try to predict whether a certain user will find a certain piece of text surprising by based on whether a language model will find reconstructing the text difficult. So essentially, the amount of unexpectedness and unpredictability reported by the language model in trying to rewrite the text from scratch might be a good proxy for the surprisal experienced by the actual human user. And you might also fine-tune the language model on the user's notes, their written notes, just to have a better sense of their models of the world, what they actually know and what they don't know, so that you can make this, so that you can align those two better. And perhaps, yeah, this would yield a good proxy. And just to help drive the point home, low surprisal might correlate with low perplexity in reconstruction. So a language model like GPT-2, fine-tuned on the user's notes, might find it really easy to predict the flow of ideas and arguments in a certain article or book or paper. Right, and those are some results based on this idea. So each green dot here is an article I scraped from the internet, and there are around 200 of those. And on the y-axis, you see reduction in perplexity given access to my notes. So what this means is that if an article is at -0.2 on the y-axis, then my notes helped make this article 20% easier to predict. And if you go up, you get increasingly unpredictable content. And if you go down, you get content which is easier to predict. Now, if we also consider another dimension, which is semantic similarity to my notes, sort of in a content-based recommender system perspective, the stuff on the right, the articles on the right are articles which are related in meaning in terms of their topic to what I'm generally thinking about, to my written notes. And stuff on the left is further away, it's not that related. Now, if you project those articles in this space, in this plane, you'll find an interesting region in this top right corner. And this is, those documents are, for one, close in terms of topic to what I'm generally thinking about, to my notes. But despite that, they're still quite unpredictable. So they seem to provide surprising perspectives, a surprising take on a topic I'm familiar with. And for instance, I managed to identify this article in this way, which is titled Notes are Conversations Across Time, so I'm interested in note-taking and conversational assistance, and also how ideas evolve over time. And this article managed to relate to all those while still being surprising. And the combination of those two, I think, made it interesting. And I think that's why this region is valuable, because just below it, those are articles on a familiar topic, but which are more predictable. So maybe if you're into color spaces, those might be introductory articles on Medium about basic color theory or something like that. If you're really into that, those might be too predictable. Yeah, I explored those ideas in a bit more depth. Yeah.
Just one question on this plot. So when you say given access to my notes, this means you're taking a language model off the shelf and fine-tuning it on all of your notes?
Yeah, and comparing the difference, because initially I tried just using the fine-tuned version, but there was a bias in like the model, the off-the-shelf model. The model itself found certain items easier to predict than the others. And I had a hunch that this correlated with the availability of the popularity of that sort of content on the internet.
Sure.
And it led it astray from what I wanted. Yeah.
So on the y-axis, you just put the perplexity of the model rather than the difference.
It's the difference, because just taking the absolute perplexity of the model had this bias, and by comparing those, I wanted to get rid of this bias of the model itself knows more about a certain topic than I do, and I wanted to get it out of the way to have a closer model of Okay, moving on. Thanks for the question. And yeah, if you're interested in those ideas, there's a more in-depth write-up here. But I wanted to mention one more thing, and that's the idea of moving away from this framing of recommending complete documents, complete pieces of content among a pool of candidates to a user, and maybe going a bit more granular and trying to identify individual paragraphs or sections or sentences which are interesting by themselves as part of a longer book, for instance. And it would be easy to see how the same approach of using perplexity of a language model as a proxy for surprisal of the user could scale down, in this case, to content fragments instead of complete pieces of content. And given this, you might perhaps be able to take in a book and identify the interesting fragments, snippets of that book for a particular user before finally compiling those in a sort of personalized summary with an increased signal to noise ratio for the user, because you're ignoring on purpose the things which came out as particularly boring. Maybe the user already had notes on that topic and you're trying to filter that out. And there are all sorts of questions around how you could go about this. For instance, how granular should you go? Should you focus on paragraphs or sentences or sections, or would an abstractive summarization step make sense at the end to add coherence to this set of fragments taken out of the book? Or would decontextualization be a suitable preprocessing step to help the fragments make more sense on their own, etc.? Yeah, so if you have ideas related to those, I'd be happy to chat, and thanks for your attention.
Hey, Paul, on the fragment angle, so let's say you want to evaluate the relative perplexity of a fragment of 10 tokens.
Mhm.
Are you going to do this by inputting just those 10 tokens or inputting the entire passage, but then only considering the 10 token chunk, but like conditioned on what came before?
Mhm. It would make sense to also consider the context itself, possibly. The decontextualization thing here, there are actually models which can take in a snippet and the context from which that snippet is extracted and try to edit the snippet so that it contains more references itself and resolve some ambiguities with pronouns and stuff like that, so that it's easier to consider the thing itself. But yeah, the other way could also be an option. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Well, we're at time, so for other discussions, questions, people should move to Discord and find Paul's channel under Research Jam category. Cool. We'll move on to Jean-Michael.
Yes, hello.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to present our work with Spherical and Yash on debugging data augmentation for domain generalization. My name is Jean-Michel Amatsa. I'm a PhD student at Sorbonne University, and I'm also a Google PhD fellow. Okay, so let's start with some context on the limits of deep learning. So if you try to evaluate, if you try to compare a model with a human, often deep learning models can have superhuman performance as long as the training and test distribution comes from the same distribution. So this is what Garros has done in 2018. So what they've done is simply to take like some images, and if the training and test distribution are similar, the models are going to perform better. If you corrupt the training and test set with the same corruption, the models are going to perform better. But if you have a slightly different corruption that you apply on the training and test set, the performance of models are going to be very bad. So it is the case of so this is basically out of distribution generalization. And there is a field of study that is called domain generalization that looks into it, how to generalize to new domains. And a new benchmark that use 10 data sets is called WILDS. And so basically it's data set across many modalities. This images that you can see is an example of that from the Chameleon data set, where we have many hospitals, 5, and we train on a set of hospitals, and we try to generalize on another kind of hospitals. So what we have done is that we have taken at first a recent data augmentation technique, Augmix, and we have applied it on 3 data set from WILDS. The first data set was Chameleon, and in this case, it performed well. It was better than the standard ERM. But if we tried to do data augmentation on other data sets, it performs worse than the simple training, the most basic one, the empirical risk minimization. And so our question is how to measure the generalization drop when the distribution shifts, because the distribution can shift in many ways. And so we have tried an experiment, a very, very simple experiment, a toy experiment on NIST. We have like the identity distribution on the far left, and we have generated 4 different data sets that are corrupted, one with Gaussian noise, one with spatter noise, one with impulse noise, and another with shot noise. And then we have extended a matrix. So basically, Ben David and all have proposed a way to compute the divergence or the distance between data distribution. They have called their distance the H distance. Basically, you have like a class of model, and you want to measure how well this class of model can distinguish between 2 data sets. And this will give you a distance or a score. And this will be the distance between 2 data sets. What we have done is that we have extended this divergence or this distance across all the classes of every of two distribution to give us a matrix. We call it a divergence matrix. And the simplest way to understand it is just to look at the matrix on the left, the far left. So in this case, we have measured the discrepancy between the identity distribution and the identity distribution. What you can see is that the diagonal is yellow. What it means is that if you take each of these distribution and you take some samples from, like, let's say the label 0 or the class label 2, they are going to be very similar. Hence, the distance between those two distribution the distance is very small. But if you look at the upper and lower triangular matrix, you are going to see that we are comparing class labels from identity. Let's say the label 0 and the label 9. They are going to be very far apart. If you can see the mouse, they are going to be very far apart, and hence, so this is the identity in this new distance that we propose. And this matrix allow us to classify two kinds of mistake that can happen when we look at different distribution. So let's look at the impulse, for instance, the fourth matrix. If we look at the diagonal, it is almost black every time. And what it means is that if you take the 0 from the identity distribution and the 0 from the impulse distribution, the class model isn't going to be able to distinguish between them. The class model is going to think that they are very different. And so this is one kind of mistake. And this kind of mistake make the generalization to drop a lot. So this is what you can see in the just upside the matrix. The OOD accuracy is 85 instead of 98. But we have another kind of errors or problem. It is mostly the case with spatter or shot. So if you look at the upper or lower triangular matrix, they are mostly yellow and not black. What it means is that if you take, let's say, you fix the class to be 5 on the identity distribution, and you sample a bunch of data, and you sample a bunch of 0 item from the spatter distribution, the class model is going to think that they are alike, and this is a mistake. So basically we can precisely quantify how the shift in distribution is going to make the model class to suffer in a generalization.
Hey, Jean-Michel, what's DH here?
So DH is the distance. Along this model class.
What does that mean?
So what it means is that if you take like the class of LeNet 5 architecture and you restrict them to do just binary classification, and you have two distribution of data, and you want to distinguish between them, you are going to have a score. This is what this distance means.
So let's say you have a bunch of MNIST 5s and you put them all through a LeNet train on normal MNIST. Mm-hmm. And rather than looking at the whole 10 length vector softmax, you're just looking at 5 versus not 5, I guess.
Exactly.
So you're taking that and projecting it to a distribution of the entire MNIST. So now you have like a histogram of all the 5s. How 5-like do they look, right?
Yeah, so it's like the 5 against the 0, how well the model can distinguish. Then the 5 against the 1, then the 5 against the 2, then the etc. The 5 against the 5, then the 5 and etc. up to the 5 against the 9. So you are taking, like, for each label, you fix the label, and then you sample a bunch of items.
Okay. Okay, so on the one hand, this sounds a little bit like just a confusion matrix, I guess.
Yes, it's a confusion matrix, but well, yes, exactly.
Okay.
It's a confusion
and also,
matrix.
So like the fourth plot here, the impulse plot. Mm-hmm. If I was to interpret this as a confusion matrix, sort of squinting, it looks like the accuracy would be very bad, maybe 20%. But here you mentioned the OOD accuracy is 85%, and yet,
yes.
it looks like the model is very, very confused, right? Can you explain this difference?
Yes. So basically, so to have this OOD accuracy, we have trained on the identity distribution, and we have evaluated on the impulse noise distribution, and we have gotten 85%, yes. But now, if you look at this confusion matrix, what it tells us is that if you take the items from, let's focus on the diagonal, if you take like items from label 0 from the identity and items from label 0 from the impulse, the model isn't going to be able to distinguish them, and etc. And this process repeats for all the item on the diagonal. This explains why this OD is generalization is the worst. And we still have other results, but due to time constraint, we have chose to not present it.
Yeah, we should wrap up probably 30 seconds.
Yes. So thank you. And if you want to discuss more, we can do it in the chat, in the channel. Thank you.
Excuse me, is there a time for one question?
Yes.
Yes, I'd like to ask, so is it expected that like the clean dataset should have an identity matrix? Because I'm just wondering how well this distance measurement would generalize to like other datasets, such as fine-grained datasets where the classes are very similar, or like, is it expected that like on the clean unaugmented datasets, it would be an identity always?
So the way I think about it is that this distance is high dimensional, and to have like a reference point or an identity, we needed to compute to compute like so actually you have as many rows as and columns. It's always going to be square matrix, and the numbers of row is going to be the number of class in your data set, whatever your data set. So if it's ImageNet, for instance, it will be a 1000 times 1000 matrix, and it is going to be very difficult to interpret it. But yes, it can generalize to any data set where you have class, where you have classes. And this identity is just to have like a reference point, because we interpret distribution shift as we interpret data sets as point on a manifold of data distribution, and we want to measure how far we are going to be with respect to different perturbation or different data sets that are similar but different. Yes.
Sure, thank you.
You're welcome.
Cool. For people who are interested, can meet Jean-Michael at his Discord room. Cool. Next up, we have Isaac right here.
So I have an idea about how to connect representational collapse in self-supervised learning and intrinsic dimension of an image dataset. So I'll be talking about self-supervised learning in visual context, I mean computer vision. So let's start. So recently, many self-supervised learning methods have proposed ways to mitigate the problem of complete collapse, where whatever be the image that you give into a self-supervised pre-trained model, you'll get almost the same kind of embedding. So, I mean, contrastive learning actually tries to give or make the embeddings between similar images or the augmentations from the same image come closer, and the negative pairs go apart. And this is a kind of like they try this to make the embeddings not collapse, but there's a different kind of collapse that happens in contrastive learning as well as non-contrastive learning. So this is called dimensionality collapse. This has been studied in a few researchers in the past year. So what happens here is, instead of collapsing to a single dimension, this collapse still happens to a smaller dimension n, where it is smaller than the original dimension of the space that you give for the embedding matrix. So it is actually seen as even the dimensionality collapse is seen as a bad thing because it's still not using the complete space that you allowed for the representations. So I'm asking a question like, is it still a bad thing? Can we get something useful out of it? So there is a different set of researchers which look into how can, like, what is the relation between the representational layers intrinsic dimension and the number of dimensions in which the manifold lies. That's the representational manifold. This can be like, you can view this from results in the manifold hypothesis. Yeah. So there is a the researchers actually concluded that for better generalization, you have to map from image as input to a low dimensional representation. So that is actually what happens in representational collapse in self-supervised learning, even if you didn't actually try to do that. So that is the problem. Like these two different fields, I'm trying to integrate them and get something out of it. So most of the like, if you consider an encoder, which is actually a lossless encoder, you should be able to get some representational dimension or equal to the intrinsic dimension of images. So intrinsic dimension of images is actually the minimum, like something like the minimum description length, or the least number of variables that the least number of latent variables from which you can actually model an image, which belongs to a distribution, which is a very high dimensional multivariate distribution. So if you consider a lossless encoding, if you if the setting is self-supervised learning, so we can encode images to representations that lie at least in an n-dimensional manifold or around it, where n is the dimension of the representations that didn't collapse, which is lesser than the total number of dimensions, that which is a capital N that you gave to it, and like this should be equal to the intrinsic dimension of the image dataset. Because if you consider if a dimensionality collapse happens, you are not giving any because it's self-supervised learning, you are not giving any labels. So if it collapses to a dimension n, which is lesser than the intrinsic dimension, that means there is some kind of information loss. The kind of encoding is now not lossless. It's actually kind of lossy. So, so essentially what I'm trying to ask is, can we find an intrinsic dimensionality of any data set via self-supervised learning? It can, like, I'm looking at contrastive methods as well as non-contrastive methods. And can I use representational collapse as a way to get to this intrinsic dimensionality of a data set? Usually in past researchers, this has been attempted by using GANs. If you consider a GAN which is trained on a set of images that you sample from a distribution, and if you like, after the GAN is trained, the images that you get out of the GAN should have the same intrinsic dimensionality of the images or set of images that you trained it on. If not, there's actually a kind of collapse happening. When a complete collapse happens in GANs, that's when we say the mode collapse is happening for GANs. So there has been some researchers in the past where they tried to find this intrinsic dimensionality using GANs, but that's actually a very I would say not very intuitive method, or the method actually it's actually more computationally complex or computationally requiring process. I'm trying to use self-supervised learning just using an encoder to find the intrinsic dimensionality. And so as representational collapse happens, and the minimum number of dimensions that can't collapse, if that is the intrinsic dimension, So as we reduce the number of dimensions, there's a general consensus that generalization improves, not across data sets, but from train set to test set. So we can also see how this finding of intrinsic dimensionality by representational collapse actually relates to generalization. So here are some references. So the first reference actually talks about dimensionality collapse in self-supervised learning, contrastive methods. So the second and third are actually about intrinsic dimensions of data representation. So intrinsic dimension of data representations has been more studied in recent times in the deep learning era than the intrinsic dimensionality of the data set itself. So I have a plot. So the plot is actually, so if you see the X and Y axis of the plot, it's between the, it's plotting the log of singular values or the log of values of singular values versus the singular value rank index. So if you see the description, it's the log of magnitude versus rank index of the ordered singular values of the covariance matrix of the embedding matrix of Representational trained using Sinclair on Spherical test set. So actually, so I understand the it's a bit confusing. So what I did is I trained a ResNet 18 using a Sinclair loss on Spherical dataset. So there has been some studies which stated that Spherikal's intrinsic dimensionality is almost 30 or a bit lesser than 30. And we what we do is so after we pre-train the ResNet 18, we take it and pass the test set of Spherical through it. So what we get is actually a 10,000 cross 128 dimensional matrix, because there are 10,000 images in the Spherical test set, and the ResNet 18's last embedding layer actually has a dimensionality of 128. So if the data was actually using, there was no representational collapse, then it would have been like, if you compute the correlation metric or covariance matrix using this embedding matrix, you would see that if I was to plot this, you actually would get a flat line. That means no dimensions are actually collapsing. But that's not the case. You can see here that collapse is actually happening. Please only look at the blue lows, the blue plot. So if you actually see, the collapse is happening somewhere between 20 and 30. To be exact, it's happening at 29. Okay. So this is actually almost equal to the intrinsic dimensionality of Spherical. It would be interesting to see if I continue training the model, will this go below 29? So if it goes much below 25 or something, we can say that there's actually some kind of loss that is happening while encoding. So the number of the latent variables is now not equal to the number of the dimensions that didn't collapse in the representational layer. The embedding layer.
Hey, Vasant, we should wrap up because we're over time, I think. But maybe we could chat in Discord about some specific thought. Yeah. Thanks for presenting.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Next we have Robert or Rupert, someone who couldn't decide on his first name. But when you're ready, you can share your screen.
All right, so you guys at this point are familiar with Nayan, Rohan, and I. As an update, two of our student abstracts are going to be presented at AAAI. One of them that I'm going to be talking about made top 20 finalist, and I have to give an oral presentation. So let's think of this as a dry run. So this is what the paper looks like. Nayan says it looks very nice from afar. It looks very nice until you look into the details, but I'm going to attempt to summarize what's going on here. So at this point, you guys have a general idea of what NAS is. Of course, eNAS is like a variant of it that uses a DAG to represent nodes. It uses an LSTM to sample layers and skip connections. And the performance estimation is used as a reward model to update the controller, so it produces better networks over time. The idea behind this project is that we can use type theory to sort of, structure neural architecture search and perhaps optimize it with some guarantees. A very easy way to make guarantees about compatibility and interchangeability are like the shapes of data. When you think of data flowing through neural networks, they all have shapes. And when they have shapes and also other numerical properties, you can make guarantees that can help you build neural networks that are optimal. Interestingly, you can treat operations and entire subgraphs as sort of equivalent because there's an input and an output. So this is just an example. This missing L0 can be interchanged with other single operations or subgraphs like the middle and the right in the tau brackets. And the way we can manipulate the shape of data is essentially using dimension functions denoted by FL and IL. IL is the input dimension, and then OL is the output dimension. Although this looks very simple, there are neural operations usually have other properties that are encapsulated by FL. So there are probably other variables involved with your operations that are not exactly shown here. I'll give you an example later. So here are some definitions. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, but on this slide, basically, we talk about equivalence properties that give you guarantees about what operations you can replace with other operations, which ones are very similar or perhaps redundant. So this, of course, gives you an opportunity to pick guaranteed but better operations that are still compatible, or to essentially reduce the search space. So equivalence properties basically tell you what operations are similar or identical to each other. They could give you guarantees about which ones are similar enough that you can replace them with each other, as I mentioned earlier on the slide. And even if operations are similar, some of them happen to perform better. So you can make guarantees about what operations you can add without affecting the compatibility of the search space. You can also use these properties to reduce redundancy. If two operations are very similar, you can probably get rid of one of them. And moving on to sequential compatibility, these properties essentially tell you what can follow what. They dictate how data can flow through the network. And the way that the shape of the data changes. And so when you're constructing a network, these properties essentially tell you like what building blocks you can add on to where you're currently at in the network and what skip connections can be made. So we, in our paper, we went through a very simple example where we took convolutional layers. Here we express the dimension function for convolutional layers. That's the equation right there. There's the input size, the padding, the dilation, the kernel, and the stride. And on the bottom of the slide is just an example of like what kind of convolutions are type equivalent, meaning they can be directly interchanged with no compatibility issues. And so our initial experiments went like this. We just took the original baseline search space from UMass.
Can you give an example of some convolution that could not be exchanged, that would not be compatible?
Sure. So for example, if you took a regular 3x3 with no padding and no stride, like it's just a 3x3 kernel, right? That would not be compatible because the mapping of the input to output sizes would be different. Right. So type equivalent, back on this slide, basically relies on like FLA being equal to FLB. So you need the mapping to be essentially linearly equivalent.
I see. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So if you actually like do the math on this and figure out what the output should be, the output size should be, you'll figure that all three of these are equivalent in terms of mapping. The basic experiment that we ran had good results. We added one type equivalent convolution to the search space. It was type equivalent to all of the convolutions in the search space. Simply adding it increased our test accuracy by quite a bit. I think that's around 4 points. And so like a generating algorithm that we can describe can essentially use the previous equation that I showed for convolutions and essentially derive the missing properties given two of them. So if I have like 2 of K, P, and D, I can derive the other one using that equation. And that's essentially what this algorithm does. And so, of course, redundancies can be easily like identified this way. And you can also use this to generate an infinite number of type equivalent convolutions. For other operations, this might be a little bit more constrained because they're more complicated. Like, for example, an LSTM, right? That would be very complicated. But you know, there are still ways you can generate other operations. And so that leads me to where we are right now. What we've written is just a student abstract, of course. There's a lot of work that can be done, and these are just kind of like the ideas that I laid out for how this could be used or how this could be expanded. I think of this, you know, as sort of an heuristic to, you know, speed up the optimization of search spaces to essentially make NAS more efficient by reducing the search space with, you know, better operations for the task. And one like really exciting thing is that we could perhaps like use the strategy to sort of layer the NAS process by doing a shallow type searches first, and then choosing best representatives for each type afterwards. And yeah, I think that's the end of my slideshow. I think because we're constrained by time, I'll just take questions on Discord.
Sounds like a good idea. And also people can catch you guys on at AAAI, which is in a month-ish, if you're going to AAAI. Cool. Our last speaker, Shubankar.
Yep, that's right. I'll just share my screen. Yes, thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm Shubhankar. I'm a high schooler from India, and today I'll be presenting my work on beyond Flatland pre-training with a strong 3D inductive bias. The pre-registration paper for this project was accepted to NeuralArTS pre-registration machine learning workshop. And I would like to acknowledge my mentors, Dr. Bernard Egger and Dr. Thomas O'Connell, without who this paper would not have been possible. So before starting off, I'd like to explain what pre-training is. Pre-training is when you train a convolutional neural network for a primary task, transfer its knowledge, and fine-tune it for a secondary task. And conventionally, this has been done using natural large-scale image databases like ImageNet. And in this project, we sort of hope to remove dependence on ImageNet. And we take a lot of inspiration from pre-training without natural images, Katauka and Ilya 2020, which introduced the concept of pre-training without natural images by generating a database called the Fractal DB. And they did this synthetically. And what is so astonishing about this is that they crossed the ImageNet 1K baseline in terms of accuracy. So why 3D mesh renders? The first up are the natural world is based in a 3-dimensional plane. So we expect that 3-dimensional mesh renders would provide more realistic looking variations, something that is closer to natural tasks than 2-dimensional fractals. Then since it is a synthetic 3-dimensional setting, an object could be rendered from different viewpoints to get a good data set. And lastly, meshes are extremely versatile. You can deform them as you want to. And this broadly is what our method is all about. We take one mesh per class, we render it from different angles, and then we train it with a ResNet 50 model. And after that, we compare its accuracy with different database ratios, and we also compare neural predictivity. And these are basically the 3 data sets that we will use in our training protocol. The first one is the ProximDB. This is generated by stacking different polygonal objects one over the other, and then basically like randomly scaling, randomly moving, randomly resizing, rotating objects, and randomly applying modifiers on them. So you can see that there's some healthy looking variation in healthy looking interclass variation, and this is what one class would look like on the right.
What loss would you be using here for the training? I missed that.
Categorical cross entropy, I think.
Okay, so this data set has classes. How many classes?
Yeah, 1,000 and 2,000. There are actually different. We're trying to replicate the one on the right, the fractal DB, by generating 2 other databases, and I'll just explain how it's all covered. Don't worry. And the second database is the Moxon DB, which is not very different from the Proxen DB. It uses the exact same meshes, and then we'll use Gaussian process deformation on them, on the meshes, to give them some variation. And this is the only one of a data set which has color, and this is per vertex coloration actually. And then at last, the Fractal DB by Katauk and Ilya 2020, they took one equation per class, and they had in the end they got 1,000 classes, and on the right you can see the healthy amount of variation they got per class. Then we come to pre-training and testing our data sets. To the left you can see our pre-training protocol and the different combinations of data sets that we'll be using. And all of these experiments, they've been thought of, and they'll give us something in the end. They will answer a question, and instances per class will stay 1,000, no matter the number of data sets in the ratio. And our testing data sets will be the exact same as what Katauk and Ilya used. And we'll also follow their training protocol so that we get a good comparative study. And then at last, we'll compare neural predictivity, since now that we have our data sets that are either rendered 2-dimensionally or 3-dimensionally, we can compare the neural predictivity and compare them with the human cognitive system. And with that, I come to the end of this presentation. I'll take questions on Discord. Thank you.
I have a burning question. How did you escalate the question to be about whether the world is flat? Is that your final question on your slide?
Yes.
Yeah, what was the jump? Why do you think the answers that you would obtain from pre-training those data set would answer whether it's a flat?
Yes, so basically, we will compare the neural predictivity of the models that are trained on 3-dimensional renders and data sets trained on completely 2-dimensional images. And we will compare both these models as well as the human brain's neural predictivity, since there are a lot of metrics to do that. And whichever we feel is closest to what the human brain achieves, we will be able to answer it. Yeah.
Okay, so now we've come to the end of our presentations. And if you guys have access on Discord, all the rooms are set up, so you can meet the speakers there. If you've already forget what they talked about, all their slides are accessible on the website, ResearchGem 6 website. Do we have anything else we want to say before we end?
The next, I'll paste the link. Yeah, next one, exactly.
Yeah, the next jam. So usually we'll pick the date at the current jam. So if we count, I think 8 weeks from now or 9 weeks from now will be March 9th. That'd be a good date. Does that collide with any conference or anything? Sounds fine.
Sounds fine, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, in 9 weeks, March 9th, people, if you want to be a speaker at ResearchGem and get your project going, you can submit through the form and we can feature you.
Cool. Well, see you guys on Discord.
See you over there.